Hi there, and welcome to another episode of From Theory to Practice, where we examine the difficulties of work as done at the sharp end. My name is Matt Davis. I'm your host. I'm a staff engineer at Blameless, and I'd like to introduce you to our panel today. Kurt, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Matt. I'm Kurt Andersen. I'm an SRE architect at Blameless and have worked here for a little while, been an advisor for a number of years, and happy to pass this over to Liz, who's also been one of our advisors for some years.
Hi, I'm Liz Fong-Jones. You may know me from the SRE versus DevOps videos that I made while I was at Google. Today, I am a principal developer advocate at Honeycomb for the observability and site reliability engineering communities.
Hi, my name is Jean Clermont. I'm a senior program manager at Flatiron Health. Manage the business resiliency programs around incident response, disaster recovery, as well as cybersecurity. Been at Flatiron for about 3 to 4 years now. Been an incident practitioner for about 10 years. I started out in 2012 as a dedicated individual contributor. Throughout the years, had plenty of experience in incident response and took on this role at Flatiron. And it's been quite an adventure setting up incident response as distributed systems. And I look forward to joining this panel to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining today. I want to welcome you to this great talk that we're going to have about tech debt. Now, tech debt is a huge subject. I want to just say that out right up front. So I just want to start off the conversation by posing a question to y'all. And the question is, why do we call it debt? Is this a metaphor that even works anymore? Liz, what do you think? Are we using the right term for what we're actually talking about here?
I think the term debt still works perfectly fine, right? Like it encompasses both that you need to put in effort to pay it off, but until you pay it off, it has this ongoing tax on your efforts, right? So I think in that aspect, it is similar to debt. I think where we get into trouble, though, is when we, try to say, there's a fixed quantity of debt, right? Like, or try to quantify it a little bit more. It's a little bit more squished than that, in my opinion.
Gene, how about you?
Well, it's been interesting for me from the perspective of incident response and the nature of how debt is even collected or logged and categorized. So from my perspective, it's been pretty interesting to come into organizations, setting up incident response and seeing the life cycle of it ending and how is that information captured, and are organizations doing it reactively or proactively? Like, what are they doing to categorize that debt to help them prioritize it later down the road? So that's, from my perspective, it's been really interesting to see it from that point of view.
Kurt, I'm interested in what you're thinking about this question too. Is this a stale metaphor?
It's pretty common. It's maybe a bit of a cliche, I guess I would say. And from taking a blameless perspective or a learning from incidents kind of point of view on this, if a company chooses to invest human toil into, let's say, upholding a system that is built with technology that is really labor intensive, then that is a choice that has been made, maybe by default. And I think most of the people involved would consider that a bad choice, at least the people on the sharp end who are having to do this toil. Whether that makes it debt per se, I don't know. I mean, it's a choice to use human labor instead of automation and not invest in the automation. I'm on the fence. I could go either way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You bring up the word toil because I think, at least when I've experienced tech debt, in fact, I've been in this very situation. So y'all let me know if you've been in this situation. I get into something where, I had accepted, or the team had accepted, the debt of doing a Terraform configuration a certain way. The way that I'm thinking about right now is a centralized module in Terraform. And we had this set of Terraform of stuff that we were deploying in many, many different clusters. And we were going to eventually change that Terraform to use a central module, but we weren't there yet. So that was tech debt that we had accepted. And maintenance after maintenance, I needed to use this old toil kind of way to do this deployment. But then when I started getting into, well, let's get it into the non-toil way, let's try to pay off some of this tech debt. But then I realized it's actually causing me much, much, much more work, not only to just move the things, but also to fix the other end, because the central module isn't prepared for the variables that it needs and all this other stuff. And a couple of times, probably more than once, I decided to go, you know what? I can't afford to pay this debt off right now. I need to stick with the toil instead. So are toil and debt, are they related, or are they, I don't know, Liz, I see you shaking your head. Yes, do you think they're related?
Yeah, I definitely think that toil is a form of operational debt. I think that there are various kinds of technical debt, right? Like one form of technical debt is something that makes it harder to write new software. But another form of technical debt is, toil in the form of this is manual work required to keep the system running. Either way, it's kind of a tax on your effort, but it manifests in slightly different ways. And depending on how your organization is set up, it may be the case that the toil is, is technical debt that's impacting one team more than another.
Oh yeah, in the case that I
Definitely.
just described, that would be the SRE team versus, because this is infrastructure that the application developers don't even see. They wouldn't even see it. And actually that reminds me of something else about technical debt that I was thinking about earlier, is how visible is it? It's very much a sharp end decision, because I've made technical debt decisions in the moment. I don't ask anybody else. How visible is technical debt?
Yeah.
And how do we make that visible, or should we, or can we make that visible to the org? And I was saying how it was very much a sharp end phenomenon.
Yeah, and I
Liz,
was
go
going
ahead.
to. Oh, go ahead, Liz. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges of making tech debt visible, right, or making toil visible, is that it then lulls you into this false sense of security that you know exactly how much there is if you can see it, right? And that's not true, right? Like the quantity of it is always imprecise. Gene, I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, Gene,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, and I was mentioning before, like during my intro, one of the things that I found interesting each stage of my career in incident response and collecting, let's say, incident post-incident action items, that's technical debt. And the way that orgs collected it made it very intriguing to me. So to even make it visible, my curiosity has always been whether organizations are proactively or reactively thinking about technical debt to begin with, so that they can take the appropriate measures to log and categorize them in different subsections of importance, such as whether there's bugs or things related to the database or things related to bugs from code. And then from there, they can prioritize and make those decisions and trade-offs. To allude back to Liz's point, where does the operation toil is too much, where it makes sense to go back to this list of technical debt for me to tackle it. So that's always been something that's interesting to me, like about the visibility of the iceberg, to the organization.
Yeah. So I want to follow up on something that you said, and that's the categorization. Do you find that very difficult? Let me maybe put it another way. When you're working on incidents, and people are creating follow-up actions and creating, tickets and things like that, do they then try to like categorize that as tech debt right there in the incident retrospective, or is this ongoing work, or how do you categorize it?
I think there's the initial approach can be just simple trend analysis based on metadata that you're tagging on your incidents. If you categorize those incidents as being part of your technical debt, environment, I mean, every organization may treat them differently, but I think through time, the trend analysis will tell you the bigger story. If you have things trading with, trending as it relates to like database failure or high CPU utilization, you may want to evaluate other things within your infrastructure that may be causing that.
Okay.
So it helps you do a deeper dive because of what's trending in your environment as it relates to those.
It gives
outages.
You some external hints about, hey, you may have some lingering debt in this area.
Yeah,
is that
correct.
What you mean?
Correct.
Okay.
That could be an approach, but it's always been curious to me of how each org does it, or are they even capturing the debt in a way that they can evaluate it in the future?
What's the difference between a bug and technical debt from your point of view, Gene?
Well, a bug can be something that was trending. I've been in environments where 5+ of the same bug causing customer impact is now considered a high target to be remediated because of this impact. So every org may have different, measuring sticks to have some sort of escalation management around bugs that impact the environment that can potentially become technical debt at a higher degree.
So the bug is not the debt itself, right? The bug is manifestation of the interest on that debt, right? Like the debt is the kind of systematic thing that makes code particularly prone to bugs.
Oh, that is a really great distinction to make. I like that very much. Again, it's kind of the image of the debt, appearing. It's not the actual debt. It's kind of like, well, this is what debt looks like. So we've had in the past, within the past year, I think, we've had a couple of, hack weeks, you might call them, where if you're not familiar with this concept, everyone stops feature work for a week. Even operations kind of stops their, forward momentum on their features and stuff, and people look at different stuff, bug squashes, kind of doing, maybe fixing some of the tech debt. And I think even in our organization, we try to focus on tech debt for like an entire quarter. And I've heard that being done at organizations too, just like, hey, for Q3, we are arresting all feature development. There will be no new features in production, and we're going to spend all of our capacity on catching up and paying off some tech debt. Is this a common thing? And I guess a follow-up question that I'm thinking about is, should we be working more towards how do we get rid of the tech debt as we're working, instead of having to create some special week or special quarter of let's erase all the tech debt and then we'll start over when the quarter's done?
That never works. That just never works, right? Like that's like saying, I'm not going to invest any money into my mortgage, and then after 5 years I'll pay it all off, right? Like, you kind of have to incrementally do it as you work, whether that be, if someone is on call, for instance, and they're not currently getting paid, right? Like, are they investing in improving documentation, improving run books, right? Like, kind of ensuring that there's kind of continuous investment in this over time. But I think the more powerful thing is the most cost-effective tech debt is the tech debt that's never created, right? Like if you can encourage people to think through when they're committing code requests, right? Like, how is this going to be maintained in the future, right? And develop that plan rather than being like, oops, we forgot to plan for this.
I think one of the problems though is that sometimes you are planning for it, but things just get kicked down the road. And what comes to mind is dependencies, for example. And there was a great talk by Eileen Uchitel last year, who was the principal engineer around GitHub finally getting off an antique version of Ruby and up to date on Ruby. And for those who don't know, GitHub is built on Ruby. And they had gotten to the point where they couldn't afford the time, quote unquote, to upgrade along the way. And so they got locked on an old version of Ruby and were like 2 years out of date. I think the details escaped me, but it was like 2 years out of date. They couldn't afford to make the jump or the incremental steps to get up to the current version and fix all the code that would need to be evolved in the same time. And so they were locked on this old version, which now, of course, has security issues and what have you. Um, and that's an example where you make an expedient decision at the time. We're not going to upgrade to the next point release or the next major release. And then it comes back to bite you because then the effort, it becomes a much larger step to catch up along the way. I mean, you might see it in your Kubernetes versions, and if you're on a cloud provider, the cloud provider might not allow you to stick on something that's very old. But when other dependencies, you might be using something that's really out of date.
Yeah, I like the approach that Liz mentioned, because to me, the incremental work throughout time to me is almost more a behavioral thing, and building good habits and culture around tackling technical debt as you go along. So I tend to feel like that's kind of the direction that I try to push engineers into incrementally, just trying to have good habits, behavior around tackling these things as they come along. And what you mentioned before, just being proactively engaged in, whether it's code reviews or anything of that nature that can promote good cultural behaviors around this stuff is the best thing you can do. So
that can be really hard. How would you recommend, just to to anyone who's writing this code today, how do they navigate this? I mean, how do they know that they're writing tech debt? How do they know that? They may not know that.
I think you have to look for the smells, right? Like, you have to look for smells like, does this, require a human being to regularly kick it, right? That's kind of that creates toil, right? Do you have this, this is my personal hobby horse, right? Like, if you do not have adequate observability, you are creating technical debt because you're not going to be able to understand it when it breaks, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of making sure that you are planning for the kind of ongoing maintenance and feeding of it, making sure that you are, writing the appropriate unit tests, right? Like, lack of writing unit tests also is very, very commonly a form of, oh, we're going to do that later, right? Like, congratulations, you've now created technical debt.
I was going to
documentation falls into that category too. I'll get around to the documentation later.
Oh yeah. I mean, documentation is my personal hobby horse. I'll put it that way. And when I see engineers not writing the docs, I get a little bit worked up. And I mean, I am nice about it. I'm not going to go yell at people to write their documentation, but the way that I try to mentor them about documentation is to write it as you're writing your other code. Just do it in parallel. And you will actually end up helping yourself. You'll actually have, you may alleviate some cognitive stress by doing that. You may end up, if you know the concept of rubber ducking yourself, kind of like talking things through, you end up doing that. By the time you get to the end of your project, look, you've built documentation. You don't have to work on it anymore. I feel like tech debt might be the same way, kind of like, well, Liz, like you were saying, unit tests were exactly the example I was thinking of. I've had that very same thing. Like, yeah, we'll have to test it later. CI/CD comes to mind. Oh yeah, well, we want to do an automated test for, we want to put tfsec and tflint into our Terraform deployments, but it doesn't really work in Circle CI the way we want it to. So we're just going to have to leave it out for now. Like, I see that kind of stuff happen too.
But you get it also in terms of choices that are made that make sense at the time that they're made. Let's use assigned integer in this field, for example, or let's use 2-digit years. We'll go back to a Y2K kind of a thing. And while it's very easy to be counterfactual and say you should not have done that, um, at the time it made perfect sense. Well, not, I don't know. It made sense at the time anyway. Um, and to try to second guess it is like it ended up being a problem and people ended up having to remediate it. Does that mean it was the wrong thing to do at the time? Not necessarily. And I think debt has this implication of a very pejorative sense of you ought not to be in debt. And I don't know that that is always the right tone to be carrying on this.
Right. You know, if you say, I think debt is a opportunity to make investments, right? Like, you know, as long as you're being smart about it, right? Like no one says, you know, don't buy a house, right? Like you might end up in debt. You might have a mortgage. Oh no, right? Like,
Right.
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 Like taking on the debt enables you to do something else, but you have to have a plan to pay it off, or eventually your debt repayments will, you know, eat all of your income, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The thing that knowing what debt you're accepting makes me think about other types of debt that you don't accept. I've heard a term called haunted graveyards, and I've heard a term called dark debt. Liz, can you tell us anything about haunted graveyards? Do you
Yeah,
like
so this is
haunted
a term
graveyards?
that was coined by JTR John Reese at formerly of Google, now at Robinhood, and he basically outlined this idea of when a system has become, you know, either through too many outages or from people like having left the company who knew how to work it. When a system becomes too scary to touch, it becomes this kind of haunted graveyard that no one wants to enter because they're like, ooh, you know, the spooky ghosts will get me, right? Like, even if there are no actual spooky ghosts there. And this is, you know, this is what happens when you don't maintain kind of collective knowledge and ownership of how to safely operate a system. And the only way that you solve that is by kind of continuously making changes to that system, kind of thoughtfully, methodically, to try to rebuild up that kind of knowledge so that it becomes less spooky.
I think you get some of that too in what John and Gene was talking about in terms of an area of your code base that is a problem magnet in some ways, that it's sort of this swamp of constant problems of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's because the knowledge is gone or whether it's because it's been patched and changed and repatched so many times that it's turned into this mess that is beyond the ability to cognitively grasp.
Or even I've had the experience of just being stumped, just being completely stumped. In fact, so stumped that I've made the decision a couple times to dump the debt. So this is an interesting concept. Instead of fixing the debt, are there other ways of getting around debt?
Sure, you can.
Bankruptcy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you've got a system that's bad, you just write a new one that replaces it. I mean, you just instead of fixing the existing system, you engineer around it, or you just, I mean, and basically throw out the bad stuff instead of trying to fix it.
How do we know that's a good decision?
You don't. But I mean, let's say
That's
at
like
one
building an
point
entirely new product, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
but let's say early in your product evolution, you decided to build your own login framework or your own payment processing framework because at the time it made sense for whatever reasons. 5 years pass, 10 years pass. There are now login as a service and payments as a service options that are out there in the market that are widely available, which will meet all of the needs of your platform. You can get rid of any debt in those areas by switching over to use the third party X as a service.
The thing that strikes me about understanding debt and being able to do something like this in the first place leads me back again to complexity and this notion of dark debt and this notion of well, we thought that we covered our technical debt, or we thought that we were robust enough, or we thought that we hit all the known unknowns, but we still had an outage.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because this processor backed up that we didn't know about, and this other thing happened at the same time. And oh, by the way, there was a tornado, and so the data center power went out the night before. And you know, and it affected our ability to restore the backup from the database, which was on this machine on the other, you know, it could be this array of complexity in which debt suddenly arises that we didn't even know existed.
I think that's why it was like, you know, having more visibility into tech debt gives you this false sense of security, thinking, you know, I know exactly how much debt I have, right? Like, you always have to plan for the unexpected, right? Like, you always have to, you know, going back to the idea of service level objectives, right? Like, you always want to make sure you have room in your error budget for unknown unknowns, right? Like, you're not going to make your budget if, you know, your known unknowns and blow out your entire budget, but just having your known unknowns fit inside of your budget is not enough.
Right, right.
So you've mentioned dark debt a couple of times, Matt. Do you want to elaborate for people who are watching this that may not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, sure. The term dark debt came out of the Stella report, which was a conglomeration of people that got together to talk about challenges in technology in complexity. And the subject of technical debt and dark debt is just one section of the Stella report. It is available online. You can go read the whole thing. And a lot of people have actually created content from it. A lot of blogs have been written about the stuff that got talked about in the Stella report. Dark debt is one of those. And the way that dark debt is categorized by the Stella report is that it arises from unseen circumstances. The presence of dark debt is in fact probably only exists in the presence of a snafu. You may only see dark debt when you have that big, huge outage. You cannot see it any other way. You cannot look at the pieces and tell that you have dark debt sitting there. So it feels like it's extremely different from technical debt to me. And so I sometimes struggle with the metaphor, which is kind of why I wanted to bring up the metaphor at the beginning, because when I'm thinking about things at the sharp end, I'm not thinking in terms of mortgages and financial things. And when I'm doing something in an incident, I'm just not thinking that way. I'm thinking about fixing things. And like Kurt, you gave the example of, well, it made sense at the time. So I think the reason that dark debt stands out to me is because it is just this another aspect of complexity that we can't, in my view, we can't pretend that we can expect it. So we have to kind of understand that the ambiguity is going to be there. And as Liz is saying, we can't pinpoint all the tech debt. Even if we go around and ask everybody, I don't think that everybody would be able to say, oh, here's the 5 pieces of tech debt I know about.
Right, that's like outages, right? Like, you know, the goal is not to prevent outages entirely. The goal is to minimize how long it takes to fix outages, because you're never going to be able to proactively prevent every single outage.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, it's interesting because it's so acute, and at the time of response, you may think it's something that could take you, you know, a few hours, and then all of a sudden you're spending a whole week on it because all these other things are unraveling. and you're identifying all these other issues. So that's a good point. Like you can't really gauge all technical debt. There's some that arise based on chains of events.
So I know actually all of us are very involved with incident response and thinking about outages and thinking about tech debt. I'm thinking about this balance again. I'm thinking about the balance of, well, this outage happened, but we have a feature release coming. But this is a very important outage to deal with. Like, we need to deal with this outage, but we're releasing this new feature in 1 month. So
we actually concretely had this happen to us, funnily enough, in November, December of 2020. We were in the process of being about to release support for OpenTelemetry gRPC. And we accidentally, everyone had good intentions, right? Blameless retrospective. We pushed a binary that was trying to listen on a privileged port, the new gRPC port, and it failed to start up in production. We couldn't scale up. We had a fairly embarrassing outage. And we had to encounter this hard thing of, there's an important partner, right? Like AWS says that they are, they would like to release OTLP support and say Honeycomb's a supported backend. And, yes, we could have put the brakes on it and said, we're not, we're actually not going to meet that deadline, right? Like, we're stopping development, right? Like, but instead we said, okay, how can we de-risk this launch, right? How can we make it so that it can have its own separate path that can't take down the rest of production, right? So there are, not every shop is going to be, able to follow Google's advice to, stop development work. That just doesn't happen in a lot of startups. So instead, it's the question of how can you mitigate that risk? How can you de-risk? And that way it has a lot of similarities to kind of security engineering, right? Like, your security engineers don't tell you no all the time, right? Like, your securities tell you yes, but.
Jean, how about yourself? Have you experienced this tug of war between features and tech debt?
Yeah, I mean, there's always this situation coming up where, it's a business decision as it relates to making sure service availability is available for the customer, and then there's the engineering decision of, like, how to tackle the issue as it relates to the business needs. So in that, that strife, there has to come to a medium that satisfies those parties in terms of helping mitigate the issue to provide the customer with the service that they need, at the same time, allowing the infrastructure to rebound for a prolonged period of time without causing too much pain in the interim. So it's always really interesting to see how those dynamics unfold, because not only do you have the system dynamics in play, you have the people dynamics in play. So that's really interesting.
Speaking of a people dynamic, is it worth incentivizing people in different ways to get rid of tech debt, whether it be, like I said, in a bug bash week, or helping them do them along the way? Or, I mean, I'm even thinking of like bug bounties, like running a tech debt bounty program in your company. Oh, I found some tech debt and I got rid of it because I had a half an hour at the end of my day.
I still think it's a lot more sustainable I think it's a lot more sustainable to just integrate that into the on-calls work, that the on-calls work, if they're not getting paid, is to pay down technical debt, right? Like, I think that is a lot better than kind of, right? Like, the incentive thing that you're talking about, Matt, that's like the hackathon thing you were just talking about.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. I on-call paying down technical debt, that's something I've seen before, and I've done this before in on-call rotations in the past, where if you're not busy with an incident and you're not busy being an interrupt blocker, here's a backlog of tech debt. Go grab something out of the backlog that's 30 minutes of work and try to get rid of this one little thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. Kurt, have you ever experienced something like that where you're able to do something like this?
Yeah, I think I've more The more common pattern I think I've seen is trying to encourage teams to deliver tech debt reduction along with feature enhancements. And so in a given time window, sprint or a month or whatever, the goal is we'll deliver 3 new features and 1 tech debt reduction. And it comes down to how you track these things in your ticketing system so that you can figure out if people are doing that. And part of it is having that backlog that Jean talked about, or you mentioned, Matt, where you can have something that's accessible.
Yeah, being able to categorize, like you were saying, Jean, being able to have those, I don't know, something to touch is what I'm thinking about. Something that actually is visible, so that, you know, it's not a surprise, or it's not, you know, overwhelming. I think often, you know, making the decision of which tech debt to work on is maybe also very difficult. Which part of this tech debt may be the seed of our next incident? I mean, that's impossible to tell.
So since we work in socio-technical systems, what about the socio side of the world in terms of this is an integrated system that we are a part of.
Ooh.
The tech side is great. Okay, it's cruft in the code. I'll use that term in general. But what about cruft in our processes? Because and it comes to my mind right now because at Blameless, we're in the process of revamping how we structure our on-call rotations right now. Because what we were doing before, we've outgrown what we've done before. And we need to evolve as teams have become larger and a little bit more specialized. We're likewise having to come up with specialized on-call rotations as an example.
Yeah, the thing that I'm thinking about, if I'm following your example correctly, is you know, doing things the old way. And we're accepting this debt of people kind of doing things the old way when we have a new way that we're trying to get people to do, but there's a lot of conflicting priorities and conflicting things, and there's too many incidents. I can't learn the new way because I'm too busy, you know, doing all this incident response with the old way. Yeah, Liz, have you ever encountered something like this where it's the socio part of the side of things that's more in debt?
Yeah, I think that tends to be best manifested in the form of like project retrospectives, right? Like talk about what was more challenging than expected during the completion of a project. Right, that you're not going to necessarily capture that in the form of incidents or in the form of, you know, this pull request is dragging on forever, the code is super complex and spaghetti, right? Like instead, you have to talk about like how did the humans feel about the process? Is the process still fit for purpose?
Right. Yes. Jean, how about you?
Off mute there. Yeah, from my experience, from what I've seen, it's really that engagement between like the tribal nature of teams and information, and the transition of institutionalizing it and allowing people to collaborate around that content. It tends to be different. Like I've been in organizations where, you know, it's been highly matured versus organizations that's in hyper growth stage, and that's where you see distortion in information from one team to other, because team members are changing teams and the team is growing quickly.
Yeah.
They're building really fast. Things are evolving really fast, and information doesn't transfer as well from one party to the other. So I think from the social standpoint, is having frameworks in place from the beginning that allows that tribal nature of just really growing pretty fast in silos. And then when you have to evolve as an organization and get into operational maturity, you get more into that institutionalizing documentation, and making sure that information is easier for people to collaborate and edit accordingly as systems evolve. So it's like a multi-stage thing that's going on there, but I think it's us as organizations or people setting the frameworks from the beginning to allow these social evolutions around the technology to evolve accordingly.
That's really interesting. The emergence of the larger organization kind of like forces that, I guess, you know, as we're growing and scaling. Um, we're nearing the end of our time here together. Does anyone have any words of advice? Because technical debt is really difficult to think about. We've touched on so many various aspects of technical debt here. Um, Again, what kind of advice would you give to, you know, a sharp-end engineer who's trying to struggle through accepting tech debt and paying it off? Liz, why don't you go first?
I think the main thing there is making the business case, right? Like you as an individual engineer, never going to make a dent in the technical debt if you're just going at it alone. So you kind of have to gather that data to show how much you're being slowed down, how much you and your team are being slowed down, and then to make the case of these are the things that we need to do to fix it, right? Like I don't think that kind of going at it alone is going to do it as a sharp-end engineer. Like there's a reason why we work in teams as a unit of delivery.
Great. Gene,
Yeah,
how about you?
absolutely. I'm definitely a fan of the business case and gathering as much data as you can to make sure that you can go in front of the judge and make your case, judge and jury, in terms of why you need the resources to tackle the technical debt. So I'm definitely a fan of using analytics and, you know, sharing your narrative as to why it's important
Gotcha.
to tackle that.
Kurt, any last words on tech debt?
I think that Gene and Liz really nailed it, that point of view that refactoring the code or fixing other technical debt is in service of advancing the business functionality, increasing the velocity of good change and decreasing the velocity of bug introduction, as the case may be. And that's the argument that will be most compelling to managers.
Thank you all for your advice here. I really appreciate this conversation. It's been really wonderful. Thank you again for joining, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Rock on.
Uh-huh.